Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, who is the Buddha to you?
There isn't a single answer to that. What the Buddha says, does, and thinks changes wildly between different types of texts. I see one Buddha who was a cosmically powerful being who prescribed a disciplined, rigorous approach to life that emphasizes one's own actions to find enlightenment. Another is a similarly powerful being who directs disciples to put their faith in his compassion and that of the bodhisattvas instead. And if I look between the lines, peel back the hagiography, imagine some details that are not recorded in the sutras, I can almost see him as a mortal who figured out how the world works. I'm sure there are many other versions I'm missing as well.
Fascinating. To me, he's a historical person, but he's also an idea. He is the idea of dharma embodied in a person, and he is the most human example of somebody living the dharma that we have ever had. I also think he is every bit as human as we are and represents the potential that human beings have for realizing the teaching of compassion and selflessness.
I suspect one would get a slightly different answer to that question from each Buddhist we ask. Having studied his teaching for so many years now, I can see that he is more than can be captured in mere words. But he's also a person for whom the singular title of Buddha is perfectly defined. His words always fascinate me, even when I question them. While I suspect most find the volume of Buddha's text daunting, for me there's a comfort to it. They're wells of new thoughts and ideas that will never run dry, and with the insurmountable number of them, the idea of reading it all in one lifetime is absurd. It means I have no urge to try and complete the mental collection, at least in this life.
Me as well. I also think that he has taken on a mythological status among his followers, especially since his passing. When he was alive, it was easy to see he was a human being, or at least closer to us than to the gods. Now that he's gone, people's imaginations run wild, and their respect and veneration for his teaching have led them to cast him in a far more fantastical light.
Agreed.
Hello and welcome to the 100th regular episode of Bright on Buddhism. For episode 63, we revisited episode 1 to see how our answers have changed and developed over the course of the show. This week, we'll be revisiting episode 2. Who is the Buddha? Is the Buddha a god? Is there more than one Buddha? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get to it. Who is the Buddha?
When we answered this question before, we focused on how the Buddha was a historical person, but not how the word Buddha is also a title that is afforded to people who have attained the highest levels of enlightenment. Someone who has achieved insight into the non-arising of all dharmas, coming to understand the nature of all causality, and has thus achieved omniscience. I hope that since we discussed that almost 100 episodes ago, we have made clear how complicated the status and title of Buddhahood is across the various schools and sects of Buddhism we've discussed. A Buddha is a person who meditates on impermanence, emptiness, and dukkha, and then attains pure and perfect insight into those concepts and into the nature of reality. They go on to teach about those things, saving all sentient beings in the process. In the Mahayana scheme, this salvation of all sentient beings is the result of, and the fulfillment of, this person's vows that they made as a bodhisattva, one who has cut off all attachments and hindrances except the desire for the salvation of all sentient beings. Buddhahood presents a heavily debated question. Can anyone and everyone become a Buddha? And if not, who can, and why? There's a wide spectrum of answers to this question. The most inclusive answer comes from Mahayana schools, such as Shingon, Pure Land, Huayan, and other related schools. Their claim is that all sentient beings can become Buddhas, and that nobody is excluded for any reason. Their argument for how this works varies. Some argue that enlightenment in Buddhahood is the default inclination of reality, and that it presents itself as being diluted and marked by dukkha as a teaching tool to us. Some argue that all beings contain this seed crystal within them that necessarily develops into full Buddhahood given enough time. Some argue that there is the potential for Buddhahood in some, but not all sentient beings. Those who do not have that potential are called Ichantakas, and they present some very complicated problems doctrinally that we've discussed. Theravada, Yogacara, and older Mahayana schools believe this way. Finally, the most narrow answer regards Buddhahood as being something that only one sentient being can do at a time. That is, at any one time, there is only one Buddha who lives the exact same life as our historical Buddha, where they're born a prince, they leave the palace after the 4 sights, and they preach all the sutras. Once that Buddha and their teachings are forgotten by the last sentient being, then the next Buddha is born and the cycle starts all over again. The Buddha before Shakyamuni was Dipankara, under whom the current Buddha was a disciple, and then the Buddha of the future is Maitreya. Related to the question of who can become a Buddha is the question of gender. Something that we didn't mention in our older episode was that there is a doctrine that only men can become Buddhas. Becoming a Buddha is a physical state as much as it is a religious state, and that state involves having male genitalia. Additionally, women are thought to be subject to several kinds of pollution and delusion that men are not, so there is misogyny from the ground up. This, as we've discussed in other older episodes, is a place where Buddhism sucks, and the doctrine is often ignored by practicing Buddhists in the world today. So all in all, who is the Buddha is a very complicated question, and to answer it is to fall headfirst into so much more complicated text and doctrine in Buddhism.
Is the Buddha a god?
In our older episode, we said no, but he could have been a type of god in a past life. We discussed the realms of reincarnation, and we discussed how the Buddha is an object of worship. Adding to that discussion now, we can say that he's not an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent creator. In Sanskrit, this type of being or material is called Ishvara, which is analogous to the Christian God, also called a prime mover. However, it can also be a matter or a material. The Buddha completely discounts the existence of any kind of Ishvara. He has done this even in our most recent Lankavatara Sutra episodes. The Buddha was a man who was born to 2 parents on earth in a time and place, and he lived to the age of about 80, and then he died. He died of food poisoning, and so we can say that he likely died in what we might call an undignified manner. However, there were characteristics about him that made him more than just a man. He may not be Ishvara, but there are many ways in which he's not the same as any other guy walking around on the street. First off, when he was born out of his mother's side. Then he walked 7 steps as a newborn and declared his own future Buddhahood. Obviously, this is not something normal babies do, and this escalated when he attained Buddhahood. This affords one the ability to know the karmic past, present, and future of all sentient beings. He also has psychic and supernatural powers. He can know the minds of anybody at any time, and he can do things like float and fly around, phase through walls, create copies of himself, grow and shrink in size, and more. These are also things that no average human can do, so they make him more than a man, but less than a god. This is at least the older and earlier Buddhist interpretation. I think that it is important to note that later Mahayana schools do attribute some godlike qualities to the Buddha. For example, in the Lotus and Lankavatara Sutras, it is discussed that the Buddha did not really die whenever he was 80 years old, as we saw in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. He appeared in this world and died performatively as a skillful means. These sutras posit that, in truth, there is a primordial Buddha who has an immeasurable lifespan, who has been enlightened for eons, and who only arises in the world and lives the life of the Buddha as a skillful means to teach sentient beings. This primordial Buddha is universal, formless, and omnipresent. His abilities and his divine nature approaches the definition of omnipotent, and if he has omnipotence, then he has 3 of the 4 characteristics of both Ishvara and Christian God. He has omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, and all he's missing is being the creator of the universe. Similarly, I think that it is an open question if worship is what creates and defines capital G Godhood, or if it's something else that defines it. In other words, this is a chicken or the egg problem. Which comes first, godhood and then worship, or worship and then godhood? I think that if enough people worship a regular guy, then even that regular guy, in light of the power and influence his image has over all the people that worship him, can attain the status of godhood. However, this opens up a complicated discussion of what does godhood mean in this context, and how does social power versus perceived supernatural power factor into it. But that's a discussion for another time. Nevertheless, if this is something the worshippers do, and not the person themselves, then that means that worship comes first and godhood second. If it's something that the god himself does, then godhood comes first. Historically, I think that it's clear that Buddhism follows the former trajectory. Veneration and worship of the Buddha came first, and then whatever godhood or godlike characteristics were ascribed to him came later. Thus, the revisited answer to this question is also, it's complicated. The Buddha is not supposed to be thought of as a god, but over the course of Buddhism's history, more and more godlike characteristics are attributed to him. There are lots of definitions of the word God, and there are many levels of godhood, and I think that the Buddha matches many of those definitions and has achieved many of those levels. Still, the Buddha himself did not want to be thought of as a god and states this directly in several sermons, so we should keep that in mind as well. Moreover, if the historical Buddha really existed, he was born a human, so that complicates how we ought to understand his status as a deity. In the West, so much of our understanding of what constitutes the human, the mundane, and the material, as opposed to the godly, the divine, and the immaterial, is defined by Christianity and Greek myth. Christianity presents a very sharp dichotomy between the human and the divine. God is divine, humans are mundane. The world of heaven is divine, the earth is mundane. Similarly, we are prone to attempting to fit Greek gods into this system. A Greek god is not a capital G god because they're not omnipotent, omniscient, or the creators of the universe. In other words, pre-Christian Greeks didn't make the distinction of lowercase g godhood for their gods like we do now. Christians make that distinction from a place of prioritizing and elevating omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, as well as being the creator and the arbiter of the universe. However, their godhood comes with supernatural power, meaning Greek gods are more influential and significant than regular humans, even if they are less than the Christian God. We're likely to apply that Christian perspective of what godhood means to any other religion we see, and it almost never matches up correctly. Many people who study Buddhism call the Buddha a lowercase g god. He isn't a capital G god because he isn't a prime mover, but he isn't a regular guy either, for reasons we've stated above. This applies the Christian normative view I've described, and it simply doesn't fit. Buddhists don't think of the Buddha as a lower or uppercase G god. Only Westerners worry about those terms. Consider that anytime this question comes up. I also think that the Buddha himself has taken on a mythologized status, especially since his death. When he was alive, it was mostly obvious that he was a mundane human being. In the texts, especially in the earlier pre-Mahayana texts, he's a very wise and advanced human being, but he's mostly mundane. It's not until the Mahayana text that we see all of this trippy, skillful, mean stuff that suggests that he has godlike abilities, and the canonicity of these Mahayana texts is ever more questionable than, for example, the first sermon, because it comes so much later and farther away from the Buddha's actual historical life. After the Buddha died and Buddhist doctrines shifted accordingly, he became reimagined and reframed as a much more mysterious and cosmic figure. For example, we have the Lotus Sutra doctrine of the primordial Buddha, where he becomes a being that exists outside the cycle of birth and death, but can enter it whenever he chooses to teach sentient beings. That begs the question, where is he? What does he look like? These questions are no longer easily answered in Mahayana Buddhism. As another example, we have the esoteric version of him where he is actually a manifestation of another Buddha. In this version, Vairocana is the whole universe, the primordial Buddha, and thus manifests as 13 different Buddhas which embody different elements of the Dharma. This introduces the question, does Shakyamuni have an identity apart and separate from Vairocana? If yes, what is it? And if not, how and why is that the case? Also very complicated questions to answer. In Theravada, the Buddha is a rare and extraordinary individual for whom the Bodhisattva path is well suited, but he's still much more down-to-earth and tangible than in Vajrayana, for example, because he is presented as a role model, a teacher, and an example of one who has done what we all should strive to do. In this version of him, is he more human or more God? Does he exist beyond the bounds of this earthly life, or is he now just an idea and a memory? If so, how is that idea and memory different from the real man, if one ever existed? More impossible questions. I think that these posthumous mythologizations and hagiographies of Shakyamuni cannot be removed from our examination of him because we live so far away in time and culture from his historical life. There will always be a mythological aspect to how we understand him and talk about him.
Is there more than one Buddha?
The answer to this question in the older episode was yes, there are infinite Buddhas. The answer here is still the same, and now we can say that we've met many of them. We've spent a lot of time with Shakyamuni in the sutras, but we've also been with Maitreya in the Lotus Sutra, Vairocana in the Adamantine Pinnacle Sutra, Amitabha in the Contemplation Sutra, and many others. Previously, we referenced the word Buddha as a title, and so it can be applied to anybody who reaches final enlightenment. Now that we've discussed these sutras in detail and met all of these different Buddhas, we can also mention how there are several layers of enlightenment, each one presented as being more advanced than the last. Buddhas are different in many ways than bodhisattvas, such as Avalokiteshvara, Samantabhadra, and Manjushri. and bodhisattvas are thus different from Pratyeka Buddhas, of whom we have few or no named examples, and Pratyeka Buddhas are different from Shravakas, who are adherents to the earliest of the early teachings of the Buddha. All of these beings are arhats, which is a title ascribed to enlightened people, but some enlightened people are presented as being more enlightened than others. Last time, we also mentioned how each of these Buddhas are objects of veneration for different sects of Buddhism. Pure Land sects venerate Amida, Zen venerates Shakyamuni, Shingon venerates Vairocana, etc. This is one of the most interesting parts of Buddhism to study because each sect has its own unique cosmology related to these Buddhas, and yet all these Buddhas are still all in those cosmologies. Vairocana is regarded as being the Buddha of the whole universe. Shakyamuni is regarded as being the Buddha of the world we live in. In other words, the world of the forms. Amida has a Pure Land that is specific to him and is in neither place, etc. It is in this diversity that Buddhism becomes Buddhisms, and it is in this diversity that scholars like myself make their whole careers. People think that there is one Buddha because no religion could ever have more than one object of worship. That's unimaginable. And by extension, they think that there is one Buddhism. But none of this is true. There are as many Buddhisms as there are Buddhists.
From what little I've studied of them, I get the impression this applies to pretty much all major religions. It seems pretty universal for there to be splinter groups after enough time and people get involved.
Agreed. We mentioned how there is only one Buddha at a time in a given place, and that was a bit of an expedient means, on my part, in the older episode. The question of how many Buddhas there are at a time in a given place is impossible to answer in a straightforward manner. In earlier Buddhism, it was truly believed that there was only one Buddha at a time. However, later Buddhism reframes this idea with the advent of Buddha lands, or Pure Lands, and also with the addition of more Buddhas with names to the cosmology. Before this, they thought that there was the earth, with Mount Sumeru in the middle, reaching to different levels of heaven where the Devas and Asuras lived. Shakyamuni was the Buddha of this realm, and it was called Jambudvipa. When Pure Lands and other Buddhas entered the cosmology later, we began to see other realms, other planes, other planets where beings can live. We also have many more Buddhas that rule over these Pure Lands. Additionally, these Buddhas were also said to have the ability to travel between these lands to visit other Buddhas and other Sanghas there. This means that no, there is not only one Buddha at a time in a given place, because there could be a Buddha from another Pure Land visiting. We also start to see very fascinating scenes in particular sutras that become incredibly famous. For example, in the Lotus Sutra, we've read and discussed chapter 11, where a jeweled stupa emerges out of the ground containing the skeletal remains of Prabhutaratna, a Buddha from many eons ago. In this scene, they're sitting side by side. This is the first time up to this point in the canon where such a thing occurs. So the new answer is that it's complicated. If you were to look at early Buddhism, you'd see that they believed that there was only one Buddha at a time. If you look at Mahayana and Vajrayana, you'd see that they believed that there were nearly infinite Buddhas and they could travel between all of their Buddha realms.
We hope you enjoyed today's revisit of episode 2. Thank you for helping us get to episode 100. That's not something a lot of podcasts manage, and I'm quite proud of it personally. So, thank you, and we hope you keep listening. Join us next week where we will be discussing the history of the swastika symbol in Buddhism. What is the history of the swastika? What does it mean? Why and how was it taken up by hate groups? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Shout out to our patrons, Tanner, Wooly, and Adine. We really appreciate your support. It means a lot to us. We are shutting down our Patreon at the end of this year. If it's still 2024 when you're listening to this, you can go to patreon.com/brightonbuddhism to read our explanation. For folks who want to support the show, stay tuned. We have started plans for something next year. Once more, we're glad you're listening, and special thanks to our patrons.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.